that the law was unimplementable. We left it at that, didn't frame rules and did not invoke the law. And finally the 1988 law got invoked after amendments in 2016. And it's sending a shiver down the spine of those who conventionally use this this methodology of round-tripping of tax avoided money or corruption money and bringing it back into the system itself. The third important area, I think, which is going to radically alter the manner in which businesses were done, is the insolvency and the bankruptcy code. Because you can't even have structured businesses operating on the premises that bank-funded money is never to be repaid back. And therefore we had a sufficient leverage of this argument which had gone to a illogical extent, and it created the problem that the banks face today. In fact, more as a lawyer, my earlier profession rather than a minister, I was quite surprised when I saw an argument being entertained in court recently that there is a right of equality in the matter of not paying the banks back. And a plea which the court decided to seriously entertain. And therefore we've lived in a system which really needed to be shaken. And of course, then lastly, the whole subject of 70 years, we have to honestly introspect, and this is the problem I am currently grappling with. For 70 years, India's democracy has completely been funded by invisible money. Elected representatives, governments, political parties, parliaments, and I must say even the Election Commission completely failed in checking it. And therefore, having failed to check it for 70 years as to how the world's largest democracy itself is funded, the solution doesn't lie today in finding a fault or a problem with every solution which is suggested. And therefore, in the last budget, I did suggest a solution. We are actively working on this. I've asked political parties, both orally in Parliament and in writing, to offer a better suggestion to me if possible that they have. Not one has come forward as yet. Because people were quite satisfied with the existing system. Every second day we watch in a public debate on television how political parties and political leaders have utilized those funds. And therefore I think when we deal with this subject of cash, it doesn't merely relate to businesses and the leakages itself being blocked, but it also really deals with how the political system is now going to be funded, hopefully in future by at least more transparent methods and by cleaner money itself. I do believe that the net impact of the demonetization exercise coupled with the GST exercise, which is going to make generation of cash a lot more difficult, will certainly lead to greater compliances, greater digitization, and already the first signs of greater digitization and expansion of the tax base, both for direct and indirect taxes, is already visible. I do hope that the discussions today on each of these subjects is able to contribute to the policy formulation which is being done in India, in which there are many minds here which contribute to that policy. And I'm certain that experts both from within and all outside who've come are certainly going to be of great value as far as we are concerned. Thank you very much, Arvind, for having organized it, and thank you very much, Dr. Thurman, for making it possible to come to India once again to participate in the discussion on the India story.
Various forms of unification within Europe, trust in domestic institutions within Europe has fallen much further. And you see that in the United States, you see that in many developing countries as well. Trust in governments, in legislatures or parliaments, trust in the media, trust in institutions generally has been eroded. We're not fully sure why, but it does seem to have something to do with the first two challenges I was talking about. The fact that we've seen a long period of stagnation of incomes in the middle of society, in the advanced economies, and the fact that in a large part of the developing world, we just haven't seen the catch-up or the convergence. I think it is still possible to combine globalization and inclusivity. It is still possible to achieve convergence amongst the developing countries. It's still possible to achieve inclusivity within societies, including the advanced societies, even in a globalized world. There's nothing in economics and there's nothing in politics that should stop this. And the reason why we haven't seen enough of it has been the failure of domestic policies. And it is domestic policies that are really the challenge and the opportunity. The challenge of combining participation in the global economy with inclusivity domestically rests on domestic policies. And we know that because there are exceptions that we can learn from. In the advanced world, if you look at Sweden, if you look at Germany, if you look at Japan, they have a much higher rate of engagement of people in the workforce, including young people in the workforce. Sweden has seen middle class incomes continue to grow. It's a highly globalized economy, in fact far more globalized than the United States, for instance. But it can be done. Singapore, for that matter, has seen continuous growth of middle income people, the incomes of the middle class, as well as of the lower income group. Domestic policies matter. India's challenges and opportunities are larger and more complex than most, but the central challenges are the same as what we all face. And it has to be said that, and I say this as an external observer, although as Arun mentioned, I take a great interest in India and have a great desire to see India succeed. It has to be said that India is making major strides in the right directions in the key areas. And I don't need to elaborate at length, but I think what you've been able to achieve in recent years in infrastructure, road, rail, ports, power, is impressive. Still a long way to go, because India has underinvested in infrastructure. Still a long way to go, but the momentum and the pace of change is impressive in recent years. The fact that India is now amongst the leaders, in fact I would say the leader amongst large countries in universal digital identification and in fact providing a unified payments interface is really impressive. You've leapfrogged the rest of the world. The progress made in overcoming a fragmented tax system and then one that also involved multiple layers of tax for businesses through the GST reforms is impressive. Not just from an economic perspective, but from a political perspective. The restoration of macroeconomic stability, both monetary and fiscal, is impressive. And most fundamentally, I would say, the intangible, changing the culture, and in particular, building political support for good economics. I think that's been the main underlying lesson of India in recent years. Building political support for good economics. Job not done yet, but I think it's been really impressive how the culture is changing. How corruption is being tackled, how invisible money is being tackled, and I'll just have to add to what Minister Jaitley said when you spoke about invisible money. and its role in democracies, you're not the only large democracy with a problem of invisible money. But impressive how the culture is being changed. But India's challenges are larger than most, and likewise your opportunities are, to my mind, the largest amongst democracies of the world. The opportunity to raise standards of living and to create inclusivity, even as you grow your participation in the global economy, are the largest amongst the democracies of the world. And I think the three key areas that will require much greater emphasis going forward for India to achieve its potential will be to do, firstly, with empowering and strengthening the role of cities. Secondly, scaling up skills training and creating a much better link between skills and jobs. And I'd say there we have a looming crisis in India. And thirdly, providing a level playing field and avoiding protection of incumbents. All these three challenges are challenges faced everywhere in the world. India's challenges are simply larger and more complex, but these are fundamental challenges. We know that cities and localities matter. And the politics of the last few years has illustrated that very vividly. Whether you look at Brexit, or the last US elections, or the French elections, or the Turkish elections, wherever you look, popular sentiment has been remarkably different and has diverged between the large metropolitan centers versus the suburbs outside of the metropolitan centers versus the small towns versus the rural countryside. Remarkable divergence in popular sentiment. Even within the US Rust Belt, which gave Trump his victory, even within the Rust Belt, there's a vast divergence between some cities and others. If you take Michigan as an example, large state, President Trump won by just 10,000 votes out of 4 million voters. Just 10,000 votes out of 4 million. But if you look at the map of which counties were won and lost by the Republicans and Democrats, Trump won almost every county. About 75 out of 83 counties were won by Trump. But total votes, he only won by 10,000 out of 4 million, because the large metropolitan cities, and in fact some smaller thriving cities, voted Democrat. Why the gulf? People in some cities are feeling down, some towns and some rural areas are feeling down, and people in some cities are not feeling down and are in fact thriving. And it's a fascinating story, because if you look at Michigan as an example, Rust Belt state, you find that there are places like Milwaukee, Minneapolis. If you go down the Rust Belt to Pittsburgh, you find the same thing. Thriving cities. They were Rust Belt cities, which had industries that disappeared. But they've reinvented themselves, they're diversified. And there's a mood of optimism in these cities. People don't feel down. Even in smaller cities, like Kalamazoo, many of you wouldn't have heard of it. It's probably less than 100,000 people. Thriving. Kalamazoo in Michigan. So why is it some cities are doing well and other cities and towns are not doing well? The reason has to do with local government, local and state level relationships, and state and federal level relationships. And that is a massive opportunity for India. There's several reasons why we have to focus on cities. First, it is where we can best integrate quality of life initiatives, which are typically about infrastructure. It's where we can best integrate initiatives that have to do with providing clean water, wastewater treatment, solid waste management, public transport, the whole range of initiatives. If you have it run nationally, you will end up having silos. If you have it run locally, it is under the charge of the mayor. Someone is accountable for integrating, and there's tremendous synergy in the way we integrate these initiatives. Critically, it is also the way we empower citizens to be able to find fault where there's fault and to be able to drive change. It is at the city level that citizens can be empowered to drive change, to raise the quality of life and the quality of infrastructure. Second important reason is that ultimately the challenge is about creating communities of learning. That's the challenge of inclusivity. Whatever job people have, whatever previous education they have, everyone can improve, gain skills, have a good job and keep improving in life if you've got a community of learning where it's not each man on his own. And communities of learning, particularly in large societies, are best organized at the city level. It's the relationship between the mayor, the educational institutions, the leading employers, the unions, the NGOs. It's a partnership. Because inclusivity at the end of the day is not just economic inclusivity, it's not just Gini coefficients and inequality numbers, but a social partnership. It's about social inclusion. And social partnerships can be immensely motivating for everyone who's involved in the partnership. The employer who takes pride in educating young people or retraining middle-aged people, those individuals themselves who feel that someone is investing in them and they want to put in even more effort themselves, the educational institutions and the local political culture that feels that it is delivering something through combined action. So cities are where social partnerships are best formed. And critically, I would say, cities are where the link between skills training and real jobs is best achieved. We don't have to look far for examples. India has them. I was struck by the fact that Bhubaneswar won a top award, international award this year, organized by the American Planning Association for smart cities. And what they did was quite interesting. They used technology to engage and empower residents to develop their own vision for the city and to help the local authorities to drive it. And this is a very exciting new approach that is taking place in India. Recently, Dr. Samir Sharma of your Ministry of Urban Development was in Singapore. And as he put it, when we think of smart cities, we have to start with people and help them to draw up a vision together with the local authorities and keep that culture of citizen empowerment going through smart cities. Smart cities are not about technology. They are about engagement, empowerment, in a way in which we achieve inclusivity, using technology as an enabler. The key has to do with funding of cities, giving them enough autonomy, but also holding them accountable. Transparency is critical. Funding, autonomy, transparency. Again, India has examples. And I notice Isha Ahluwalia here. I must say that she's done exceptionally good work in bringing up the successful examples. Surat in wastewater treatment, Pune in solid waste management, which in fact Minister Jaitley was just telling me about yesterday. Maharashtra is a state that has empowered its cities and held them accountable, particularly in water reforms. In fact, Maharashtra has had remarkable success in water reforms compared to other states, conducting water audits for all its cities, state funding the water audits or helping to fund the water audits, helping them discover the gaps, find the solutions, and then holding them accountable to deliver the solutions. And if you look at how Nagpur, which found through its water audit that it had more than 50% water loss, with the bulk of that happening in the process of transportation of water, how it was able to reduce dramatically the loss of water. It's a very good story. how they set up a corporatized entity, 100% owned by the Nagpur city authorities, how they entered into a PPP relationship, not blindly, but a proper PPP relationship, how they went for economic pricing of water. These are examples that you see not just in Nagpur, but you can see these examples around the world of how things change. I would say particularly important too is the work that Niti Aayog is doing in benchmarking, because we need transparency to drive competition. Without transparency and the bright light of sunshine on good performance and bad performance, competition doesn't work well. And competitive federalism in the Indian context has to involve competition between cities, not just states, because the Indian states are very large. They're really equivalent to large countries around the world. Your largest states are larger than most medium-sized countries in the world. So competition between cities has to be a critical dimension of competitive federalism in India. And what we really need to do is get a virtuous cycle of transparency, accountability, and performance. It has worked in some states in India. It has worked in many provinces in China. It has worked in many places around the world. Transparency, accountability, and performance. A virtuous cycle. Second challenge, and this is India's biggest challenge, is jobs. It is a real challenge going forward because India has lost a lot of time. You've lost a lot of time because you have legislation, employment legislation that's really anti-employment. You've lost a lot of time because you have an education system that has not prepared people for the needs of the modern economy, and that applies to both the school system as well as the tertiary education system. And it's now a race against technology, which we all face. Robots and artificial intelligence have had limited effects so far in most economies, but the pace of change is going to accelerate. We see it in the United States. We see it here in India already. I've been looking at some accounts. If you go to Surat, you can meet specialty chemicals manufacturers who are introducing robots. You go to Aurangabad, auto parts manufacturers who are introducing robots and reducing headcount. It's already happening. High upfront capital expenditure in the robots, but in exchange for that, high quality because of a much reduced rate of mistakes, high productivity. Unfortunately, robots don't take breaks. And high certainty on future cost inflation. So high capital expenditure, but a lot of benefits that come out of that. And the capital expenditure is going down because robots are getting cheaper. So this is now a real challenge. The window of opportunity for labor-intensive activities is going to narrow in the years, is narrowing. And I would say if India doesn't make major and urgent changes in the next 10 years, we have a real problem on our hands. And the same is true for much of the developing world. The link between skills and jobs is critical. India has taken significant steps in skills training, but the link with jobs has been weak, and placement in jobs has been weak. And I think what's critical in this is the involvement of employers, not just in providing inputs and feedback on what curriculum should be provided in educational institutions, but involvement of employers in training. Internships, apprenticeships, on-the-job training, deep involvement of employers in training. That is critical. That's how we get placement rates up. And I'm glad to see, by the way, that the placement rate in the skills center that India and Singapore are jointly running in New Delhi has been 100%. In fact, their motto is 100% employment from the first hour of graduation. That's the first challenge, creating a much better link between skills training and jobs. so that it's not wasted money and it's not frustrating for the individuals. The second challenge is to really rethink education, which is currently heavily front-loaded into the initial years of a person's life, the first 18 or 22 years of life, towards a system of continuous learning through life, where at regular intervals in one's life, throughout adult life, we have to all go through bites of learning that involve not just conventional educational institutions, but involve employers, involve collaboration, and involve the communities of learning that I spoke about. I think that's going to be critical. It can be done. In fact, in Singapore, that's our most important economic and social strategy. We call it Skills Future, investing in people through life, and not just front-loading the investment early in life. That too is critical to growing skills that are relevant to the job market and relevant to real economic opportunities. And thirdly, first I spoke about the involvement of employers. Secondly, I spoke about lifelong investment in learning. Thirdly, think about the incentives we are providing, because India still incentivizes capital investment, labor replacing investment, so to speak, and needs to incentivize skills training more. We need to have, at the very least, neutrality of incentives between investments in skills training and investment in equipment and technological innovation. And we all face that challenge everywhere in the world. We have to incentivize training by employers, and employers working together with the state and educational institutions. And finally, I think there's a real opportunity coming out of technology itself. The shared online platforms that are being developed offer great potential. They offer potential to break the market failure that exists now between skills and jobs, or training and jobs, because there's massive market failure, massive mismatch of skills and the real demands of employers. And the online platforms that are being developed allow us to close those gaps and to have a far more efficient system of training that is related to real jobs, real placement opportunities, and real career progression. But it's also very interesting how shared online platforms are leading to employment opportunities in the rural areas. And India is in fact one of the very interesting examples of that. How rural women, for instance, are trained to use the internet to then deliver services, distributing telecoms products, sometimes delivering financial services, how they're involved in data collection, a whole range of ways in which we can provide employment, even outside the cities, using shared online platforms. So that's the second big challenge, and I would say it's a looming crisis. I say this quite frankly for India, and there have to be major, concerted and urgent measures taken to tackle the skills challenge. Otherwise, we have a real problem on our hands, and a demographic dividend will become a demographic deficit or crisis in the years to come. Finally, avoid protecting incumbents and provide a level playing field. This is a tendency everywhere in the world, this tendency to protect incumbents. You see it in the US, you see it in the most advanced economies, and you see it in most developing economies. The firms that already have a lead have a way of capturing regulation so that their lead is preserved and new entrants are deterred. People who live in the best neighborhoods or the cities with the best quality of life try to protect it to themselves. They protect their housing through exclusionary zoning policies, which are the policies of local authorities who support people who want to protect their own neighborhoods, avoid housing from expanding. You see it in London, you see it in many American cities, you see it in France. Protecting housing, protecting schools, protecting jobs. People who have advantages like to protect what they have. And the task of government, local and federal, has to be to level the playing field and avoid protecting incumbents. Because when we think of the challenge of towns and rural areas that are down, part of the challenge, of course, is in regenerating them, finding new economic activities, in which they can be competitive. But the other part of the challenge is to encourage mobility, because mobility has always been the major force for productivity and income upliftment internationally. But mobility can't take place if you don't have housing being expanded and being accessible in the cities that are doing well. If you don't have schools that are accessible, and schools which are not segregated but schools which fix people up. So we have to, as a cardinal public policy tenet, always think of leveling the playing field and avoiding the protection of incumbents. Protection from trade, protection from new entrants, protection from someone else who wants to enter the same job or occupation as you. The role of the GST in that regard will over time be, I think, much greater than the immediate benefits that you're going to see. There are immediate benefits. These are what you might call the static efficiency gains. More revenue for the state, but it comes out of, it also means efficiency gains for businesses. But the dynamic advantages over time that come from the dynamism of competition, a level playing field in competition between cities, between states, and the increased competition that will come about over time, is to my mind the real advantage of a GST system over the multiple layers and the fragmented system that you've had before. India has examples of new entrants who are dying to get at the incumbents, and there are already examples of new entrants who are showing how they can gain market share quickly. In Mobi, very interesting example, in Mobi, which is in the mobile advertising game, is now the third in the world. It's set up by a group of Indian individuals. It's now the third largest in the world, competing with Google and Facebook. They were set up only in 2006. A few months ago, 11 years later, they've turned profitable, and they're growing very well. Upstart player, gaining market share, pushing the incumbents aside. Paytm in the digital wallet space, again growing very well. Indigo Airlines, for that matter, Vistara, new airlines that are gaining market share. It's remarkable what Indigo has done. It now has a 40% share of the domestic market. New entrants have a different urge, a different spirit of innovation, and we need that fighting spirit in all our economies. And I say this not just for India, but for Singapore and all our economies. Avoid protecting incumbents. Make sure that new entrants are able to enter every field. The competition is what produces productivity enhancements, innovation, and ultimately broad-based inclusion in economic growth. So to conclude, India's challenges are large, they are complex, they are weighed down by history as well as given confidence by history. But the challenges are essentially shared by all our societies. And I think if we get local empowerment and partnerships right at the city level, if we scale up skills training massively, but create a much better link with jobs through the engagement of employers, and if we avoid protecting incumbents, India will show how it is possible to combine globalization with inclusion. And it will show how you can get past this intriguing problem highlighted in the economic survey, the last economic survey, which is the fact that some of your states are moving further away from each other. The fact that the laggard states are not catching up with the most advanced states. In fact, the gap is growing. It's not a given. It's not an inexorable fact of economic life. It is a failure of domestic and local strategies. And it can be fixed. It can be fixed. So I end again by saying that I'm optimistic about India because of the pace of change, the momentum of change, and most fundamentally that new culture that is being created. A culture that rewards good economics with political support, and a culture that builds political support for good economics. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think
a higher level of exports and higher level of imports together compared to having a low level of exports and a low level of imports. High exports and high imports is a vastly superior strategy to low exports and low imports. And the reason for that isn't about demand, it's about supply. Engaging in the global economy and subjecting yourself to competition with the best and the near best means a constant dynamism and a constant discipline of learning. That's what globalization should be about. And too much of globalization in the past was too passive. It was about commodities being exported. And if you look at many African countries, for instance, their economies are doing the same thing today that they were doing 50 years ago. The same single commodities, or sometimes 2 or 3 commodities, simply being harvested and exported. Very little learning, very little of a ladder of advancement. So globalization has to be about this discipline of learning and the dynamic of moving up the ladder. Manufacturing still offers it, but the window is limited. And I think we have to take serious steps in the next 10 years to get export manufacturing going. In India, in much of Asia, in much of the developing world. There's still an opportunity. So the simple answer is, there's no lack of market for exports if you're also willing to import more. If the world exports and imports for a given level of demand is better than a world that doesn't export and import. And the reason has to do with the supply side logic of innovation, productivity advancement, skills advancement, and then, as a result, income advancement.
Okay, I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. And since we have about 15 minutes with Tharman, we want to maximize Tharman, not you. So the question has to be brief and just one question. No commentary, pontification. Quick, snappy, brief, one question. Floor is open. Sunil, please. Can someone, mics, please? Or why don't I give you mine?
You know, you made the point. Well, you made the point, sir. This is Sunil Jain from the Financial Express. You made the point that India's employment laws are actually anti-employment. There is a jobs crisis. Even the government, accepts it. So how do you explain the fact that when a government accepts that we have an employment problem, it presumably knows that there is a jobs law which is anti-jobs? How come no government, either of the day or before, is able to change anything? How do you get the government to change? You talked about an economy where good economics is good politics. So how do you explain this, and how do you get the political system to make the necessary changes in the law?
Well, I think I'm obviously not qualified to answer that question, and it'll not be wise for me as a Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore to be answering that question. But let me just say that I think that when we talk about competitive federalism, it should also involve giving real autonomy to states and cities to be able to move ahead and move the boundary on labor legislation and land. I understand that in fact some of these provisions are in place and laws have been enacted some time ago, but we have to move ahead with some states and cities taking the lead and showing through results that it works.
I think the gentleman there had, please.
Yeah, in the political economy literature, it is often argued that the negligence to the education sector is largely because there is a hardly political gain to the government when there is whether it is there investment in education or not. So the gain from the investment in education, which is visible for the voting politics, is very less. As a result, it is being there is a long negligence to education sector. What is your opinion on this?
Well, my view, and again speaking as an outsider, is that no one is really gaining from today's highly inefficient system of education in India. I don't see anyone benefiting from the fact that you've got high rates of teacher absenteeism, that you've got problems of nutrition at a younger level, that you have a mismatch between jobs and skills at the tertiary level. No one gains from it. I don't see government gaining from it or local politicians gaining from it. Employers don't gain from it. And certainly the individuals lose out because of this. So there's